Forgive me!
It is too late.
I have nowhere else to go.
My husband left me for his 29-year-old secretary. 3 years later, he showed up at my door begging for help. My husband didn't just leave me. He packed his bags while I was at the hospital with my mother. Twin marriage ended with a text message. I've found someone who makes me feel alive again. She was 29. I was 58. He thought he had won. 3 years later, the man who said I was too old knocked on my front door in the middle of a thunderstorm, crying, begging me to save his life. What happened next shocked everyone in our family. Welcome back, friend. If you're new here, I'm so glad you found your way to this story. Settle in, get comfortable, and if you enjoy the journey we're about to take together, don't forget to like this video and subscribe so you never miss what's coming next. I was standing in a hospital corridor that smelled like antiseptic and fear when my phone buzzed in my coat pocket. My mother was 3 rooms away, hooked up to machines that beeped in a rhythm I had memorized over the past 6 hours. I almost didn't check the message. I wish now that I hadn't. The text was from Richard, 29 years of marriage, and he told me in 14 words. I've found someone who makes me feel alive again. I'm not coming back, Margaret. I'm sorry. I read it 3 times before the letters stopped making sense. A nurse walked past me with a clipboard, and I remember thinking how strange it was that the world kept moving while mine had just stopped cold. I slid down the wall until I was sitting on the floor of that corridor, my legs no longer willing to hold me up. Nobody stopped to ask if I was all right. In a hospital, everyone assumes your grief belongs to someone else's chart. By the time I got home that night, the closet in our bedroom was half empty. His side of the bathroom counter was bare, except for a faint outline in the dust where his cologne bottle used to sit. He hadn't even left a note taped to the mirror. Just silence, and the hollow sound my footsteps made in a house that used to be full. I called Grace before I called my own children. Grace Bennett had been my best friend since we were 22 years old, back when we both still believed love was something that only grew stronger with time. She showed up at my door in her bathrobe, car keys still in her hand, and she didn't say a single word. She just wrapped her arms around me and let me shake against her shoulder until I had nothing left to cry. He's 60 years old, Margaret, she finally said, pulling back to look at me. What in God's name is he thinking? I didn't have an answer. I still don't, not really. All I knew was that the man who had promised to grow old beside me had chosen someone barely older than our own daughter instead. Her name was Vanessa Brooks. She'd been Richard's secretary for 2 years, ever since his old assistant retired. I'd met her exactly once, at the company Christmas party, where she'd shaken my hand with a smile so bright it should have warned me. 29 years old, sharp gray eyes, and an ambition that practically hummed off her skin. I remember thinking she was going places. I just never imagined those places included my husband's bed. My daughter Emma arrived the next morning still in her work blazer, having driven 3 hours straight from the courthouse the moment I called her. Emma had always been the fighter in the family, a lawyer who argued for a living and rarely lost. But when she stood in our kitchen and saw the moving boxes Richard's assistant had dropped off for his remaining belongings, she went quiet in a way I'd never seen before. I'll handle the divorce paperwork, she said finally, her voice flat and controlled, the way she must have sounded in front of a judge. You won't have to deal with him directly, not once. My son Daniel showed up that evening still in his firefighter uniform, soot still clinging faintly to his collar from a call earlier that day. He hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and when he pulled away, his eyes were red. I always thought Dad was one of the good ones, he said quietly. Then he sat down at our kitchen table and didn't say another word for a long while. The weeks that followed blurred together in a haze of paperwork, sympathetic glances from neighbors, and nights where sleep refused to come. I was 58 years old, and for the first time since college, I had to learn what it meant to be alone. Not lonely in the way people mean when they say it lightly. Truly alone, in a house built for 2 people and a family that had grown and scattered. Richard, meanwhile, seemed to be living a different life entirely. Word travels fast in a town like ours, and it wasn't long before I heard he'd moved Vanessa into a downtown penthouse, the kind with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river. He bought her a car. He canceled a business trip to Cancun with me the year before, claiming it wasn't in the budget, yet somehow found the money for a getaway to the Caribbean with her within months of leaving me. I won't lie and say it didn't hurt in ways I couldn't fully put into words. There were nights I sat in the dark, replaying every year of our marriage, searching for the moment things had gone wrong. Had I missed something? Had I failed him somehow, without even realizing it? Grace refused to let me spiral into that kind of thinking for long. You didn't fail anyone, she told me one evening over coffee, gripping my hand across the table. A man doesn't leave a good woman because she failed him. He leaves because he stopped being a good man. It took me months to start believing her. I sold the house eventually, the one Richard and I had built together, brick by brick, over 3 decades. It held too many memories that had turned sharp and painful, like furniture rearranged in the dark. I bought a smaller home near the lake instead, one with a garden I could tend to with my own 2 hands, and slowly, painfully, I began to rebuild something that resembled a life. I started volunteering at the community center, teaching reading to children who reminded me of my old classroom. I reconnected with old friends I'd let slip away during the busy years of marriage and motherhood. Grace and I took a trip to the coast that spring, just the 2 of us, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I laughed until my stomach ached. Richard, from what I heard through the grapevine of our small town, was thriving. His construction business had expanded into 2 new counties. He and Vanessa were seen at every gala, every ribbon-cutting ceremony, every high society dinner our town had to offer. People said he looked happier than he had in years. People said a lot of things. I told myself it didn't matter anymore. I told myself I had moved on. 3 years passed that way, each one a little easier than the last. I turned 61 in the spring, surrounded by my children and grandchildren at a small gathering in my new garden. For the first time since Richard left, I felt something close to peace. Then came the storm. It was a Tuesday night in late autumn, rain hammering against my windows so hard I could barely hear the television over the noise. Thunder rolled across the sky in long, rumbling waves, and I remember thinking how grateful I was to be warm and dry inside my own home, a home that belonged only to me. That was when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps against my front door, followed by a pause, then 3 more desperate this time. I set down my cup of tea and walked toward the door, my heart pounding for reasons I couldn't yet explain. Through the frosted glass panel, I could make out the silhouette of a man standing on my porch, soaked to the bone, his shoulders shaking. I opened the door. Richard stood there in the pouring rain, 63 years old now, his once proud posture bent and broken. His expensive coat was drenched through, his hair plastered flat against his forehead, and his face was streaked with what I first mistook for rain, but quickly realized were tears. "Margaret," he said, his voice cracking on my name like he hadn't spoken it aloud in years.
It is too
"Please,
late.
I need your help.
I have
I
nowhere
don't have
else to
anywhere
go."
else to go." I stood frozen in my doorway, staring at the man who once told me I was too old to make him feel alive, now standing before me utterly broken, begging me to save him from whatever had brought him to my door in the middle of a thunderstorm. I had no idea yet just how much his life had fallen apart. I had no idea how much Vanessa Brooks had truly cost him, and I had no idea that this single moment, standing in the pouring rain with the man who shattered my heart, would force me to make the hardest decision of my entire life. I didn't move for what felt like a full minute, my hand frozen on the doorframe while rain blew sideways onto the porch and onto Richard's ruined shoes. Every instinct I'd built over 3 years told me to close the door. Every ounce of pride I'd rebuilt piece by piece told me he didn't deserve to stand on my welcome mat, let alone inside my home. But then lightning cracked across the sky, and I saw his face clearly for just a moment. He looked nothing like the confident man who once ran a construction empire and dismissed me over a text message. He looked like a stranger wearing Richard's skin, hollowed out and gray, his hands trembling not just from the cold. "Please, Margaret," he said again, his voice breaking. "Just 5 minutes, that's all I'm asking." Grace's voice echoed in my head, warning me against foolish softness. My daughter Emma's voice echoed too, reminding me I owed this man nothing. But there was another voice, quieter and older, the one that had taught elementary school children for 30 years and still believed in basic human decency, even for people who didn't deserve it. I stepped aside and let him in. He dripped water onto my hardwood floor, and I handed him a towel without a word, watching him wrap it around his shoulders like a man twice his age. He sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where Daniel had once sat in stunned silence after Richard left us. The irony wasn't lost on me. "What happened to you?" I finally asked, keeping my voice steady, refusing to let it shake the way my hands wanted to. Richard let out a laugh that had no humor in it at all. "Vanessa happened," he said. "Or I guess I should say, I happened to myself. I was the fool who let her happen." Over the next hour, sitting across from the man I once vowed to spend my life with, I learned the truth about the years I'd spent hearing whispers of his glamorous new life. The penthouse downtown had been in Vanessa's name from the very beginning. paid for entirely with money drained from his business accounts. The Caribbean trips, the luxury car, the designer wardrobe, all of it funneled through accounts Richard had foolishly given her access to, back when he still believed she loved him. She had me convinced I was some kind of visionary, he said, staring down at his hands. She told me I deserved a bigger life, a newer life. She helped me expand the business into 2 new counties, and I thought it was because she believed in me. Turns out she was setting up shell companies the entire time, moving money where I couldn't see it. I sat there listening, feeling something twist inside my chest that I couldn't quite name. It wasn't sympathy, not exactly. It was closer to recognizing a wound and knowing exactly how deep it could cut, because I'd survived one just like it myself. 6 months ago, she left, Richard continued, cleaned out what was left of the accounts she could access, and disappeared. By the time my lawyers untangled everything, the business was already collapsing. 2 of my biggest contracts fell through. I had to lay off 40 employees, Margaret. 40 families. I thought of all the men and women who'd worked for Collins Construction over the years, people who'd come to our old house for summer barbecues, people whose children I'd once taught in my classroom. My chest tightened at the thought of what they must be going through now. And that's not the worst part, Richard said, his voice dropping even lower. He looked up at me then, and for the first time in 3 years, I saw genuine fear in his eyes. 3 months ago, I collapsed at a job site. They ran tests. Margaret, I have congestive heart failure. Stage 3. My doctor says without proper care and major lifestyle changes, I might not see another 2 years. The kitchen went silent, except for the storm still raging outside, rain hammering against the windows in relentless waves. Why come to me? I asked quietly. Why not your new friends? The people at all those galas? Surely someone in that circle can help you. Richard's laugh this time sounded even more broken than before. They disappeared the moment the money did, he said. Turns out none of them ever cared about me at all. Just what I could give them. I sat back in my chair, studying this shattered version of the man who'd once made me feel like the most foolish woman in the world. Karma, it seemed, hadn't just knocked on his door. It had kicked it wide open and taken everything with it. I'm not asking you to take me back, Richard said, seeming to read the hesitation on my face. I know I don't deserve that, and honestly, Margaret, I know I never deserved you at all. I'm asking for help navigating this. The medical bills, the business collapse. I don't know who else to turn to. Emma won't answer my calls. Daniel hangs up the second he hears my voice. I thought of my children, of the years of pain and anger they'd carried on my behalf, anger I'd worked so hard to release from my own heart. If they knew Richard was sitting in my kitchen right now, soaked from the storm and asking for my help, I wasn't sure how they'd react. I need time to think, I told him finally. You can't stay here tonight, Richard. I hope you understand that. He nodded, looking almost relieved that I hadn't slammed the door in his face outright. I have a room at the motel off Route 9, he said. It's not much, but it's what I can still afford. Before he left, standing on my porch as the rain began to ease into a soft drizzle, he turned back to look at me one final time. For what it's worth, he said, I think about the day I left you almost every single day. I told myself I was chasing something real. Turns out I traded something real for something that was never anything at all. I closed the door behind him and stood there in my quiet kitchen for a long time, staring at the damp towel he'd left folded neatly on my table. 3 years of healing, 3 years of rebuilding a life I was finally proud of, and now the man who'd broken it apart in the first place was standing at my door, asking me to help put his life back together. I didn't know yet that this would only be the beginning. I didn't know that within days, Emma would discover something about Richard's collapsing business that would change everything we thought we understood about his fall from grace. And I certainly didn't know that Vanessa Brooks wasn't finished with the Collins family, not even close. I called Emma the next morning before I'd even finished my first cup of coffee. I couldn't keep something like this from my own daughter, not when it involved her father showing up broken and desperate on my doorstep in the middle of a thunderstorm. Absolutely not, Emma said the moment I finished explaining. Her lawyer voice came through loud and clear over the phone, sharp and final. Mom, you cannot get involved in his mess. He made his choices. Let him live with them. I'm not saying I'm taking him back, I said, gripping my mug a little tighter. I'm saying the man is dying, Emma. Heart failure. He has nowhere else to turn, said. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Send me everything you know, Emma finally said, her voice softening just slightly. Every detail. If he's really being honest about his business collapsing, I want to see the paperwork myself before you do anything. It took Richard 2 days to gather what Emma requested, sitting once again at my kitchen table while she reviewed his contracts and financial statements over a video call, her sharp eyes scanning every page with the same intensity she brought to her courtroom cases. I watched her expression shift from skepticism to something closer to alarm. "Dad," she said finally, looking directly into the camera, "did you know Vanessa Brooks incorporated 4 separate shell companies using your business's tax identification number?" Richard's face went pale. "What?" "They're registered in Nevada," Emma continued, pulling up documents on her screen. "Brooks Holdings LLC, Riverside Ventures, Crestline Capital, and one called Ambervale Group. All 4 were funded through wire transfers from Collins Construction's operating account over the past 2 years. Dad, this isn't just personal theft. This is fraud, and depending on how it's structured, you might actually be liable for some of it since your signature authorized the original accounts she had access to." I watched the color drain even further from Richard's face as the weight of Emma's words settled over him. 20 years of building his business from nothing, and Vanessa Brooks had systematically dismantled it from the inside while he was too infatuated to notice. "There's something else," Emma said, her voice growing quieter. "I ran a background check on her. Standard procedure for a case like this." "Dad, Vanessa Brooks isn't even her real name. She's been operating under at least 3 different aliases across 2 states. There are civil suits filed against her in Georgia and Tennessee, both alleging nearly identical financial schemes against wealthy business owners." Richard sat frozen at my table, staring at his own trembling hands. "She was planning this from the very beginning," he said quietly, "from the moment she started working for me." "It looks that way," Emma confirmed. "Dad, I need you to understand something. If we're going to help you untangle this legally, you need to be completely honest with us about everything. No more secrets, no more surprises." I watched something shift in Richard's expression then, a kind of surrender I'd never seen in him before, not even in our worst arguments during our marriage. He nodded slowly, and for the first time since he'd shown up at my door, I saw a flicker of the man I remembered from our early years together, before ambition and vanity had hollowed him out. Grace, of course, had strong opinions when I told her everything over coffee at her house that afternoon. "You do understand what's happening here, don't you?" she said, setting down her cup with a sharp clink against the saucer. "He's not coming to you because he's changed, Margaret. He's coming to you because you're the only person left who might actually help him." "I know that," I said. "But Grace, he's sick, really sick, and that woman destroyed everything he built." "He destroyed his own marriage," Grace reminded me gently, "long before Vanessa Brooks ever walked through his office door." I couldn't argue with that. I still can't, not really. But there was something about watching a man who'd once seemed larger than life crumble so completely that stirred something complicated in my chest, something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't quite indifference either. Daniel came by that weekend, still hesitant to even say his father's name aloud. "I don't understand how you can even look at him," he said, pacing my kitchen with the same restless energy he'd had since childhood. "After everything he put you through." "I'm not looking at him as your father right now," I told my son honestly. "I'm looking at him as a human being who made devastating choices and is now facing the consequences in the cruelest way possible. That doesn't mean I've forgotten what he did to this family, Daniel. It just means I haven't forgotten how to have compassion either." Daniel didn't respond right away. He just stared out my kitchen window toward the lake, his jaw tight. "Mom," he finally said, "if you do this, if you help him, I need you to promise me something. Promise me you won't let him back into your life the way he was before. Promise me you won't let him hurt you all over again." I promised him I wouldn't, and at the time, I believed every word of it completely. What none of us knew yet, not me, not Emma, not Daniel, was that Vanessa Brooks hadn't disappeared at all. She was still very much active, and she was far from finished with the Collins family. Within the week, she would resurface in a way none of us could have possibly anticipated, forcing all of us to confront just how dangerous the woman who destroyed Richard's life truly was. The call came on a Thursday afternoon while I was tending to the roses in my garden, the ones I'd planted the same spring I moved into my new home. Emma's voice on the other end of the line sounded tighter than I'd heard it in months. "Mom, I need you to sit down," she said. I lowered myself onto the garden bench, my gloved hands still dusted with soil. "What is it?" "Vanessa Brooks was spotted in town yesterday," Emma said. "One of my colleagues saw her having lunch at that new bistro on Main Street. Mom, she wasn't alone. She was with a man, and from what my colleague overheard, it sounded like she's already running the exact same scheme on someone new." My stomach dropped. "Does Richard know?" "Not yet," Emma said. "I wanted to tell you first. Mom, if she's still in town, that changes things. It means there's a real possibility we can build a case against her, especially if we can find her current target before she does to him what she did to Dad. I thought about the man sitting across from Vanessa at that bistro, likely oblivious to the danger sitting right beside him, sharing a glass of wine and a warm smile that concealed something far colder underneath. I thought about how easily Richard had been charmed, how a man who'd built an empire through decades of hard work and shrewd business sense had been so thoroughly blindsided. I called Richard that evening, and I could hear the tremor in his voice the moment I mentioned Vanessa's name. "She's still here?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Margaret, if she's already found someone new, we need to warn them. Whoever this man is, he has no idea what's coming for him." For the first time since he'd shown up at my door in that storm, I saw something in Richard that reminded me of the man I'd fallen in love with 30 years ago. A man who cared about more than just himself, who felt a genuine pull toward protecting someone else from the same devastation he'd endured. It was Grace, of all people, who managed to identify the man from Emma's colleague's description. "Bill Harrison," she said over the phone, sounding almost breathless with the discovery. "Margaret. He owns 3 car dealerships across the county. His wife passed away almost 2 years ago. Everyone in town knows he's been lonely since then." The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Vanessa Brooks had found herself another wealthy, vulnerable man, and she was likely already weaving the same web of false affection she'd used to unravel Richard's entire life. Emma, ever the lawyer, insisted we approach the situation carefully. "We can't just show up and accuse her of something without proof," she said, during a family meeting at my kitchen table that included, for the first time in years, both of my children and their father sitting together in the same room. "But if we can get Bill Harrison to talk to us, to compare notes with what happened to Dad, we might have enough for the district attorney to actually take this seriously." Richard volunteered to be the one to approach Bill directly. "He deserves to hear it from someone who actually lived through it," he said. "Not some lawyer with a case file. Someone who understands exactly what she's capable of." I watched my children exchange a look across the table, both of them clearly surprised by the sincerity in their father's voice. It was the first time in 3 years that Richard had shown any interest in protecting someone other than himself. The meeting between Richard and Bill Harrison took place at a diner on the edge of town, away from prying eyes and Vanessa's watchful gaze. Richard called me afterward, his voice heavy with a mixture of relief and dread. "He believed me," Richard said. "Margaret, he'd already given her access to one of his dealership accounts. She told him it was for a joint investment opportunity, something about expanding into electric vehicle sales. He was 2 days away from wiring her a substantial amount when I got to him." Bill Harrison, shaken by how close he'd come to suffering the exact same fate as Richard, agreed to work with Emma and the district attorney's office, providing documentation of Vanessa's proposal, along with recorded conversations where she'd made several damning promises about the fake investment. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, it felt like the tide was finally turning against Vanessa Brooks. But as Emma reminded us during a call that evening, a woman clever enough to run this scheme across multiple states wouldn't go down without putting up a fight of her own. "She's going to find out we're building a case," Emma warned. "And when she does, she's not going to run quietly. Women like her never do. None of us could have predicted just how right Emma would turn out to be, or how far Vanessa Brooks was willing to go to protect the empire of lies she'd built." Vanessa found out about our efforts faster than any of us anticipated. Within days, she showed up unannounced at Richard's small rented apartment, the modest one-bedroom he'd moved into after losing the penthouse she'd once convinced him to buy for her. Richard called me immediately afterward, his voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard since his diagnosis. "She threatened me, Margaret," he said. "She said if I keep helping Bill Harrison build a case against her, she'll make sure everyone knows about certain business decisions I made over the years. Decisions that weren't exactly ethical." My stomach tightened. What decisions? Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Some of the contracts I won over the years, especially early on, involved cutting corners on permits. Nothing that ever hurt anyone, but nothing I'd want the county inspector's office looking into too closely either. Vanessa knows all of it. I told her everything back when I thought she actually loved me." I sat with that information for a long time after we hung up, turning it over in my mind. Part of me wanted to tell Richard this was exactly the kind of consequence he deserved for the choices he'd made throughout his life, both in our marriage and in his business dealings. But another part of me, the part that still remembered 30 years of shared history, felt a genuine pull to help him navigate his way out of the trap Vanessa had set. Emma, when I told her, immediately went into lawyer mode. "This is called witness intimidation," she said firmly. If Vanessa is threatening Dad to keep him from cooperating with the investigation, that's a crime in itself, and it actually strengthens our case rather than weakening it. We arranged a meeting with the district attorney's office that week, Richard laying out everything Vanessa had done, including her threats, with a level of honesty I hadn't seen from him in years. The assistant district attorney, a sharp young woman named Patricia Nguyen, listened carefully to every detail before speaking. Mr. Collins, based on what you're telling us, along with Mr. Harrison's cooperation and documentation, we have enough to move forward with formal charges, she said. Fraud, wire fraud across state lines, and now witness intimidation. This isn't a small case anymore. We believe Miss Brooks, or whatever her real name actually is, has done this to at least 6 other victims across 3 states. 6 other lives, shattered the same way Richard's had been shattered, the same way I'd watched him crumble on my doorstep in the pouring rain. The scale of it left all of us sitting in stunned silence. Vanessa was arrested 2 weeks later at a hotel just outside the county line, attempting to check in under yet another alias. The arrest made local news, and for the first time since she'd disappeared, with what remained of Richard's fortune, our entire family finally felt like we could breathe again. Richard called me the night of her arrest, his voice filled with an emotion I couldn't quite place. "It's over," he said. "Margaret, I keep waiting to feel relieved, but mostly I just feel exhausted. Exhausted and ashamed of how blind I let myself become." I sat on my back porch that evening, listening to the crickets by the lake, and found myself reflecting on everything that had happened over the past several weeks. The man who once told me I was too old to make him happy was now sitting in a rented apartment, battling a failing heart, having narrowly escaped complete financial and legal ruin at the hands of a woman who'd never loved him at all. Grace, when I told her everything, was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "So what happens now?" she asked. "Now that the danger's passed, now that karma has done its work, what do you do with him, Margaret?" It was the question I'd been avoiding for weeks, the one that sat heavy in my chest every single night. Richard was still sick. His business was still in ruins, and despite everything, despite 3 years of anger and grief, and slowly rebuilding a life without him, I found myself unable to simply walk away and pretend I felt nothing at all. "I don't know yet," I admitted to Grace. "But I know I can't keep doing this halfway. I have to decide, once and for all, what role he's going to play in my life going forward." I didn't yet realize just how soon that decision would be forced upon me, or how the answer would come from somewhere I never expected. Emma showed up at my house unannounced on a Sunday afternoon, her expression serious in a way that immediately put me on edge. She sat across from me at my kitchen table, the same table where Richard had confessed everything just weeks before, and folded her hands in front of her. "Mom, I need to say something, and I need you to really hear me," she began. "I've watched you help Dad through the legal mess with Vanessa. I've watched you show him compassion he honestly didn't earn, and I understand why you did it. I do. You're a good person, Mom. Probably too good sometimes." "But," I asked, sensing where this was heading. "But I'm scared," Emma admitted, her lawyer composure cracking just slightly. "I'm scared that all of this, the crisis, the illness, the vulnerability, it's going to convince you to take him back. And Mom, I need you to remember who he was before any of this happened. I need you to remember the text message. I need you to remember sitting in that hospital hallway with Grandma while he packed his bags." Her words hit harder than I expected. "Emma, I haven't forgotten any of that." "I know you haven't forgotten," she said, "but forgetting and forgiving aren't the same thing, and I'm worried you're confusing the two. Dad is sick and scared and alone, and that makes people desperate to fix whatever mistakes they can still fix. But that doesn't mean he's actually changed, Mom. It just means he's finally facing consequences." I sat with her words for a long time after she left that evening. She wasn't wrong, not exactly. There was something dangerously easy about mistaking someone's desperation for genuine transformation. I'd taught elementary school for 30 years, and I'd seen it in children too. Kids who behaved perfectly the moment they got caught doing something wrong, only to return to old patterns the second the consequences faded. Was Richard any different? I thought about the years of our marriage before Vanessa Brooks ever entered the picture. The years I'd spent slowly shrinking myself to accommodate his growing ego, his growing business, his growing sense that he deserved more than the quiet, steady life we'd built together. I thought about how many times I'd swallowed my own needs, my own dreams, to support his ambitions instead. I decided to visit him the next day, driving to his small rented apartment on the edge of town, the modest space that stood in such stark contrast to the penthouse Vanessa had once convinced him to buy. He looked thinner than the last time I'd seen him, his color worse, and when he opened the door, I could see the exhaustion etched permanently into his face now. "Margaret," he said, surprised, "I wasn't expecting you." "I need to ask you something," I said, standing firmly in his doorway. "And I need you to be completely honest with me, Richard. More honest than you've ever been in your entire life." He nodded, gesturing for me to come inside. "If none of this had happened," I said once we were seated, "if Vanessa hadn't drained your accounts, if you hadn't gotten sick, if your business was still thriving right now, would you have ever come looking for me? Would you have ever felt a single ounce of regret about what you did to our family?" Richard was quiet for a long, long time, staring down at his own hands the way he'd done so often since arriving at my door that stormy night. "I want to tell you yes," he finally said. "I want to tell you I would have realized my mistake eventually, regardless of what happened with Vanessa. But Margaret, I promised myself I wouldn't lie to you anymore, not after everything you've done to help me. Honestly, I don't know. I'd like to believe I would have found my way back to understanding what I lost. But I can't promise you that with certainty, not when everything in my life was still going exactly the way I thought I wanted it to go." His honesty, brutal as it was, actually helped clarify something in my mind that had been muddled for weeks. Richard hadn't sought me out because he'd had some profound realization about the value of our marriage, or the person he used to be. He'd sought me out because he was drowning, and I was the only person left who knew how to swim. "I appreciate you telling me the truth," I said, standing to leave. "I think I finally understand what I need to do." I drove home that evening with a strange, quiet clarity settling over me, the kind of clarity that only comes after finally asking the questions you've been too afraid to ask. Emma had been right to warn me, but she'd also given me exactly what I needed to make peace with the decision that had been forming in my heart for weeks, long before I even realized it myself. What none of us anticipated was that Richard's health would take a sudden, dangerous turn just days later, forcing me to confront my decision far sooner than I ever expected. The call came at 2 a.m, Daniel's voice tight with barely controlled panic on the other end of the line. "Mom, it's Dad. He collapsed at his apartment. The paramedics are taking him to Memorial now. It's his heart." I threw on the first clothes I could find and drove through empty streets, still slick from another evening rain, my hands gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary. By the time I arrived at the hospital, Emma and Daniel were already there, standing together in a waiting room that felt eerily similar to the one I'd been standing in 3 years earlier, when everything first fell apart. "They're saying his heart failure has progressed faster than expected," Emma told me, her lawyer composure completely gone now, replaced by the raw fear of a daughter watching her father's mortality become suddenly, terrifyingly real. "They're running tests, but Mom, the doctor said if his heart doesn't stabilize soon, he might need a transplant. And even then, at his age, with his current health, the odds aren't good." We waited together for nearly 4 hours before a doctor finally emerged, her expression carefully neutral in the way medical professionals learn to master. "We've managed to stabilize him for now," she said. "But I won't sugarcoat this for you. Mr. Collins's heart is significantly weakened. Without a transplant within the next several months, I don't believe he has much time left." The words landed like physical blows. Daniel sat down hard in one of the waiting room chairs, running his hands through his hair. Emma reached for my hand, gripping it tightly, and for a moment, the three of us simply sat in stunned silence, absorbing the weight of what we'd just been told. They allowed us to see him briefly once he'd stabilized enough for visitors. Richard looked impossibly small against the hospital bed, tubes and wires connecting him to machines that beeped in that same rhythm I remembered from my mother's hospital room years before. His eyes fluttered open when I approached, and something in his expression shifted the moment he saw me standing there. "Margaret," he whispered, his voice barely audible, "I didn't think you'd come." "Of course I came," I said, pulling a chair close to his bedside. "Richard, the doctors say you need a transplant." He nodded weakly. "They told me. I've already looked into the numbers, Margaret. At my age, with the state of my heart, I'm not exactly at the top of any transplant list. And even if I somehow made it onto one, the wait could be anywhere from 6 months to 2 years. I don't think I have that kind of time." I sat with him in silence for a long while, listening to the steady beep of the heart monitor, watching the rise and fall of his chest as he breathed. This was the moment Emma had warned me about, the moment where desperation and genuine change became almost impossible to distinguish from one another. "Richard," I finally said, "I need you to understand something clearly, and I need you to really listen to me this time, the way you never listened to me during our entire marriage. I am not coming back to you. Not now, not ever. Whatever happens with your health, whatever happens with the rest of your life, I am not going to be your wife again." His eyes filled with tears, though whether from the pain of hearing it or simple exhaustion, I couldn't quite tell. "I understand," he whispered. "But," I continued, my voice softening slightly, "that doesn't mean I'm going to abandon you to face this alone. I've spent 30 years of my life connected to you, Richard, and despite everything, despite the pain you caused this family, I still believe in showing basic human compassion, even to people who don't necessarily deserve it. I will help you navigate your medical care. I will make sure Emma and Daniel have the resources they need to support you if that's what they choose to do, but I will do it as someone who once loved you, not as your wife." Richard closed his eyes, tears slipping down toward his pillow. "That's more than I deserve," he said quietly. "More than I ever imagined you'd be willing to give me after everything." I stayed with him until visiting hours ended that night, and as I drove home through the quiet streets, I felt a strange sense of peace settle over me, the kind that comes from finally making a decision, you know, deep in your bones is the right one. I wasn't taking Richard back. I wasn't erasing 3 years of hard-won healing and independence. But I also wasn't going to let bitterness turn me into someone incapable of compassion, even toward the man who had once broken my heart so completely. What none of us could have anticipated was the phone call that would come just 2 days later, one that would change the entire trajectory of Richard's medical crisis, in a way that felt almost impossible to believe. The call came from the hospital's transplant coordinator, a kind-voiced woman named Dr. Patel, who asked to speak with the entire family together. We gathered in a small consultation room, Emma, Daniel, and I, sitting nervously across from her desk, while Richard remained upstairs, still recovering from his initial collapse. "I have some news that I think will surprise all of you," Dr. Patel began. "When we ran the standard family compatibility screenings as part of the transplant evaluation process, we discovered something unexpected. Daniel, your tissue and blood type are an extraordinarily close match for your father, closer than we typically see, even among immediate family members." Daniel sat up straighter in his chair. "Are you saying I could be a donor?" "Living donor heart transplants aren't possible, obviously," Dr. Patel clarified, "but this discovery has actually opened up a different pathway. Given the strength of the match and your father's specific condition, we can move him significantly higher on the transplant list under certain circumstances. Combined with a few other factors, including his relatively recent diagnosis and previously good health, I believe we can find him a matching donor heart within a much shorter certain circumstances. Combined with a few other factors, including his relatively recent diagnosis and previously good health, I believe we can find him a matching donor heart within a much shorter time frame than we initially projected." Daniel sat back, visibly overwhelmed by the sudden turn of events. Emma reached over and squeezed his hand, and I watched my 2 children share a look loaded with complicated emotion, the kind that comes from being asked to save the life of a father who had caused so much pain to their family. "I need to think about this," Daniel finally said. "Not the transplant list stuff, that's obviously good news, but everything else, what this means for our family going forward." Over the following weeks, our family found itself in an unusual limbo, waiting for updates on Richard's position on the transplant list, while simultaneously working through the complicated emotions that came with his sudden vulnerability. Emma continued handling the legal fallout from Vanessa's arrest, working closely with the district attorney's office to build a case that would eventually help 6 other victims across 3 states find some measure of justice. Daniel, despite his hesitation, began visiting his father regularly at the hospital, the 2 of them slowly, carefully rebuilding something that resembled a relationship, though nothing close to what it had been before Richard's affair shattered our family. I watched my son struggle with forgiveness in real time, watched him wrestle with the same questions I'd been wrestling with for weeks. "I don't know if I forgive him," Daniel told me one evening after a hospital visit, "but I don't want him to die either, Mom. Is that strange? Is it possible to feel both of those things at the same time?" "It's not strange at all," I told my son. "It's actually the most human thing in the world." Grace, throughout all of this, remained my steady anchor, the friend who never judged my complicated feelings, but also never let me lose sight of my own hard-won progress. "You're handling this with more grace than I ever could," she told me one afternoon over coffee. "I'm not sure I could have shown that man an ounce of kindness after what he did to you." "Some days I surprise myself too," I admitted. 6 weeks after Richard's collapse, Dr. Patel called with news that a matching donor heart had become available. The surgery was scheduled for the following week, a delicate procedure that carried significant risks given Richard's weakened condition, but one that represented his best, and possibly only chance at survival. The night before his surgery, I visited him alone at the hospital, finding him staring out his window at the parking lot below, lost in thought. "Margaret," he said, when he noticed me standing in the doorway, "I've been thinking a lot these past few weeks. About everything. About the life I threw away. About the family I nearly destroyed completely." "Richard, you don't need to do this right now," I said gently. "You need to focus on getting through tomorrow." "I need to say this while I still can," he insisted, his voice firm despite his physical weakness. "Whatever happens tomorrow, whether I make it through this surgery or not, I need you to know that these past few months, watching how you and our children handled everything with more grace and strength than I ever showed any of you, it's taught me more about the person I should have been than 60 years of my own life ever did." I sat with him for a while longer that night, neither of us saying much else, simply existing together in the quiet hospital room, two people bound by 3 decades of shared history and 3 years of painful separation, waiting to see what the next chapter would bring. The surgery began early the next morning, and our family settled into another waiting room, another vigil, hoping desperately for an outcome none of us could control. The surgery lasted just over 6 hours, the longest 6 hours of my entire life. Emma paced the waiting room relentlessly, occasionally stepping outside to take calls from her office, though I suspected she mostly needed the fresh air to manage her own anxiety. Daniel sat perfectly still most of the time, his firefighter training seeming to kick in, the same calm focus he must have relied on during emergency calls throughout his career. When Dr. Patel finally emerged, still in her surgical scrubs, her expression carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had just spent hours fighting to save a life. "The surgery went as well as we could have hoped," she said, and I felt the collective breath our family had been holding finally release all at once. "His body is accepting the new heart well. So far, we'll need to monitor him closely over the next several days, but I'm cautiously optimistic about his recovery." Relief washed over all 3 of us, though I noticed it manifested differently in each of my children. Emma allowed herself a rare display of emotion, tears slipping down her cheeks as she hugged her brother tightly. Daniel simply closed his eyes and exhaled slowly, years of complicated feelings finally finding some small measure of resolution. Richard's recovery, once he woke from the surgery, proved slow but steady. I visited him regularly over the following weeks, though our conversations gradually shifted away from the crisis that had brought us back into each other's orbit and towards something quieter, more reflective. "I've had a lot of time to think in this hospital bed," he told me one afternoon, several weeks into his recovery, "about the kind of father I want to be to Emma and Daniel going forward, assuming they're even willing to let me try, about the kind of man I want to become with whatever time I have left." "And what have you decided?" I asked. "I want to rebuild my relationship with our children, slowly, if they'll allow it," he said. "I want to find some way to make amends to the employees I laid off when the business collapsed, even if it takes years to do it properly. And Margaret, I want you to know that I understand, completely and without any resentment, that none of this means we're finding our way back to each other romantically. I understand that ship sailed the moment I packed my bags while you sat in that hospital hallway with your mother." His clarity, his acceptance of the boundaries I'd set weeks earlier, brought a strange sense of closure to something that had been weighing on my heart since the night he first appeared at my door. Vanessa Brooks, meanwhile, faced her own reckoning. Emma called me the week after Richard's surgery to share the news that the district attorney's office had successfully built a comprehensive case against her, incorporating testimony not just from Richard and Bill Harrison, but from 4 additional victims across Georgia and Tennessee who had come forward once news of her arrest made regional headlines. She eventually accepted a plea deal that would keep her incarcerated for the better part of a decade, along with restitution orders that would take years to fulfill, though everyone involved understood that fully recovering the financial devastation she'd caused across multiple families remained unlikely. I found myself reflecting often, during quiet evenings in my garden by the lake, on everything that had unfolded over those strange, difficult months. 3 years of careful healing, interrupted by a storm that brought my broken husband back into my life, followed by revelations about betrayal and fraud that stretched far beyond anything I could have imagined, culminating in a medical crisis that forced our entire family to confront questions about forgiveness, compassion, and the complicated nature of love after devastating betrayal. Grace, of course, had her own perspective on everything, delivered over coffee on my back porch one warm afternoon. "You know," she said, watching the sunlight dance across the lake's surface, "I think you handled this whole situation in a way most people simply couldn't have. You showed compassion without sacrificing your own dignity. You helped a man who wronged you terribly, without ever losing sight of the boundaries that protect your own heart. I'm not sure everyone would see it that way, I admitted. Some people might say I was foolish for helping him at all. Some people confuse forgiveness with weakness, Grace said firmly, but real forgiveness, the kind that actually sets you free rather than trapping you in old patterns, that takes more strength than most people ever realize. I thought about her words often in the weeks that followed, as Richard continued his slow recovery and gradually began rebuilding fragments of his relationship with our children, always respectful of the clear boundaries I'd established, never once pushing for anything more than the compassionate friendship I'd offered him. But even as our family found a strange new equilibrium, I knew there was one final conversation still waiting to happen, one that would determine, once and for all, exactly what role Richard would play in the remaining chapters of my life. 6 months after Richard's surgery, on a quiet spring afternoon much like the one when he'd first shown up soaked and broken at my door, he asked if we could talk somewhere private, away from hospital rooms and family gatherings, and the complicated dynamics that had defined our interactions for the better part of a year. We met at the lake near my house, sitting together on a bench overlooking the water, the same water that had brought me so much peace during the years I'd spent rebuilding my life without him. Richard looked healthier than I'd seen him in a long while. Color returned to his face, though the humility that now defined him felt permanent in a way his old arrogance never had. "I wanted to thank you properly," he began, "for everything you've done these past several months. For helping me navigate the legal mess with Vanessa, for being there through my surgery, for allowing our children back into my life, even after everything I put this family through." "You don't need to thank me, Richard," I said. "I did what I believed was right, not what was easy." "I know that," he said. "And I also know that what I'm about to ask might not be fair, given everything that's happened. But Margaret, I need to ask you directly, one final time, if there's any part of you that could imagine us finding our way back to each other. Not the way things were before, obviously. Something new, built on everything we've learned this past year." I sat with his question for a long moment, watching sunlight dance across the lake's surface, feeling the weight of 30 years of shared history alongside 3 years of painful, necessary separation, and everything that had unfolded since that stormy night he'd reappeared at my door. "Richard," I finally said, "I've thought about this question more than you probably realize. I've asked myself, over and over, whether the compassion I've shown you these past months was actually a sign that some part of me still wanted our marriage back. And I've come to understand something important about myself in the process." He waited, watching me carefully. "I don't hate you anymore," I continued. "I haven't hated you in a long time, honestly, though I spent years believing I did. But not hating someone, and even caring about their well-being, that's not the same thing as wanting to rebuild a life with them. I've built something entirely new for myself, Richard, a life I'm genuinely proud of, filled with purpose and peace and relationships that don't require me to shrink myself down to accommodate someone else's ambitions." "I understand," he said quietly, though I could see the disappointment in his eyes. "What I'm offering you," I said, "is something different than romantic love, but I don't believe it's something lesser. I'm offering you the friendship of someone who genuinely wants to see you heal, who wants to see you rebuild meaningful relationships with our children and grandchildren, who wants to see you find purpose in whatever years you have left. That's not nothing, Richard. That's actually quite a lot, especially considering everything that happened between us." Richard nodded slowly, seeming to absorb the finality of my words alongside the genuine warmth behind them. "It's more than I deserve," he said, echoing words he'd spoken to me months earlier in his hospital room. "And honestly, Margaret, I think it's exactly what I need. A chance to become a better version of myself, without the crutch of a marriage I never fully appreciated while I had it." We sat together for a while longer, watching the water, two people who had once promised each other forever, and instead found themselves navigating an entirely different, unexpected ending. One built not on romantic reconciliation, but on something quieter and perhaps more mature. Mutual respect, hard-won compassion, and the recognition that some relationships find their healthiest form not in reunion, but in a peaceful, dignified letting go. In the years that followed, Richard slowly rebuilt his life, eventually starting a much smaller construction consulting business that allowed him to mentor younger contractors without the crushing ambition that had once consumed him. He became a genuinely present grandfather to Emma's children and Daniel's growing family, showing up to birthday parties and school recitals, with a humility that had been entirely absent during his years running Collins Construction at full speed. I continued building my own life by the lake, surrounded by my garden, my volunteer work at the community center, and the steady, unwavering friendship of Grace Bennett, who remained by my side through every twist this strange journey had brought us. Emma eventually made partner at her law firm, carrying with her the lessons of resilience she'd learned watching her mother navigate impossible circumstances with grace. Daniel found his own peace with his father, slowly, imperfectly, the way most complicated family healing actually happens. As for Vanessa Brooks, she remained behind bars, her carefully constructed web of lies finally and completely unraveled, leaving in her wake 6 broken families, slowly finding their way back toward wholeness, each in their own time, each in their own way. I often think back to that thunderstorm, to the broken man standing at my door begging for help, and I no longer feel the bitter sting of old wounds when I remember it. Instead, I feel something closer to gratitude, strange as that might sound. That storm, and everything that followed, taught me the difference between forgiveness and weakness, between compassion and self-sacrifice, between letting go and giving up. I learned that healing doesn't always look like people expect it to. Sometimes it looks like reconciliation, but sometimes, and I believe this was true in my case, it looks like finally finding peace with someone's absence from your heart, even while choosing to remain present in the more practical corners of their life. Either way, I discovered something I never expected to find again after that devastating text message 3 years earlier. A version of myself I could be genuinely proud of, standing steady through betrayal, through crisis, through the complicated work of forgiveness, emerging on the other side not as the woman Richard left behind, but as someone entirely, powerfully her own. If this story touched your heart, let me know in the comments. What would you have done in her place? Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another unforgettable story of family, betrayal, redemption, and hope. Thank you for spending your time with me today. Take care of yourself